The day a man in a polished coat walked into Evelyn Mercer's orphanage, 14 children had no idea their entire world was about to be ripped from underneath them. One cold October morning. 4 sentences, 60 days to vanish. 11 years of scraped-together meals, patched roofs, and whispered lullabies, gone because a dead man's son needed to cash out his inheritance. But nobody counted on the rancher. Nobody counted on what one stubborn, quiet man would sacrifice when the whole town looked away. Stay with me until the very end, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The orphanage sat at the edge of Clover Falls like something the town had agreed to forget. It wasn't ugly, exactly, but it had that particular look of a building that had been loved too hard for too long. Paint fading in long vertical strips along the eastern wall, shutters that didn't quite sit flush anymore, a front porch step that groaned so loud every morning it had practically become a member of the household. The vegetable garden out back was scraggly and ambitious at the same time. Half-dead tomato plants staked up with old wooden spoons because nobody had thought to buy proper stakes, and there were always more pressing things to spend the money on. But inside, that building was the loudest, most alive place in all of Clover Falls. And Evelyn Mercer intended to keep it that way. She was 41 years old and looked like someone who had decided, somewhere around 34, that sleep was more of a suggestion than a requirement. Not haggard, but weathered in the specific way of a person who carried weight that wasn't entirely their own. Dark circles lived permanently beneath her gray eyes. Her dark hair was almost always pulled back in a knot that started the morning neat and ended it completely undone, loose strands falling across her forehead, while she stirred soup or balanced account ledgers, or talked a crying 6-year-old back from the edge of a nightmare. She had come to Clover Falls 11 years ago as a newly trained social worker, assigned to evaluate the facility and write up what everyone expected would be a quiet little recommendation to close the place down. The orphanage had been falling apart then, underfunded, understaffed, and run by an elderly woman named Margaret Holt, who was kinder than she was capable. The county had already written the paperwork. The building was supposed to become a storage annex for the county clerk's office. Evelyn had spent 3 days doing her evaluation. On the 4th day, she drove back to the county office, set her clipboard on her supervisor's desk, and told him she was resigning effective immediately. Then she drove back to Clover Falls, knocked on Margaret Holt's door, and asked if she could stay. Nobody who knew Evelyn from before fully understood that decision. She'd had prospects. She'd had a tidy apartment in the city and a career path that made sense on paper. Her mother had called it a breakdown. Her college roommate called it a phase. 11 years later, she was still in Clover Falls. Margaret had passed 4 years ago, quietly in her sleep in the small bedroom at the end of the hall, leaving Evelyn everything, which amounted to a building, 14 children, 6 outstanding repair bills, and a coffee mug that said "I survived Monday" that Evelyn had used every single morning since. She didn't regret a single day of it, even the hard days. Even the days when the donations dried up and she had to figure out how to stretch a $40 grocery budget across 16 people and make it feel like a meal worth sitting down to. Even the days when a child raged at her, screaming things no child should know how to say, things they'd heard from adults who should have known better. And she had to stand there and absorb it because she understood, better than most, that those words weren't really meant for her. She didn't regret any of it, right up until October. The morning Henry Ashford arrived was cold in the particular way of early October in that part of the country. Not the brutal cold of February, but the kind that catches you off guard. Sharp. Presumptuously cold for what the calendar still insisted was nearly fall. Evelyn had been up since 5:30, which was normal. She'd already started a pot of oatmeal, broken up a minor dispute between 2 of the younger boys over whose turn it was to feed the cat, confirmed that the leak in the upstairs bathroom was, in fact, getting worse, and written 3 separate items on the same sticky note she'd already lost twice. She was standing at the kitchen counter with her coffee when she heard the car pull up. Not a familiar car. She knew every vehicle that came down that road with any regularity. The grocery delivery truck on Tuesdays, Pastor Webb's old Ford on Sundays. Even though she'd made clear several times that Sunday service attendance was optional, the blue minivan belonging to the county social worker who did monthly check-ins and always smelled like lavender and bureaucratic exhaustion. This car was a dark sedan. Expensive. Clean in the way that suggested it had never once been parked on a dirt road before today. Evelyn set down her coffee. She stepped onto the front porch just as the man got out of the car, and her first thought, the honest one, before the polite ones lined up behind it, was that he had the look of someone who had never personally delivered bad news before and was relying heavily on his coat to do it for him. The coat was good. Charcoal wool, well fitted, the kind of coat that cost as much as Evelyn spent on heating for a month. He was somewhere in his late 30s, blonde hair neatly combed, carrying a leather portfolio under one arm. Good-looking in an unforgettable sort of way. "Ms. Mercer?" he said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps and not coming closer, as if the step itself was a kind of border he wasn't entirely sure he had the right to cross. "That's me," she said. She didn't invite him in. Not yet. There was something in the way he was holding himself, careful, almost braced, that told her she probably wanted to hear whatever this was in the open air. "My name is Henry Ashford," he said. "My father was Roland Ashford." She knew the name. Roland Ashford had owned this property, had owned it for 30 years, in fact, and had been the kind of landlord who was easy to forget because he never caused trouble. He cashed the modest rent checks Evelyn sent every month without fail, never raised the rate, never demanded anything. She'd met him only once, a brief handshake at a hardware store 3 years ago. He'd seemed like a decent man. He died in August. "I heard about your father," Evelyn said. "I'm sorry for your loss." Henry Ashford nodded the way people do when they've heard that phrase enough times that it has stopped landing anywhere meaningful. "Thank you," he said. And then, "Ms. Mercer, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you'd prefer that." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I would." He opened the portfolio, pulled out an envelope, held it out toward her with the careful extension of a man who knows the thing he is offering is going to cause damage the moment it changes hands. "My father's estate has been finalized," he said. "This property was included. I've accepted an offer on it from a development group." The morning was very quiet for a moment. Down the road, a crow called from somewhere in the bare oak trees. Evelyn took the envelope. She didn't open it immediately. She looked at Henry Ashford's face instead, reading the discomfort there, the way he was very carefully not meeting her eyes. "What kind of development?" she asked. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. "A boutique hotel," he said. "The Clover Falls area has been attracting tourism investment over the last few years. The location it's a good location." "It's a children's home," Evelyn said. "Yes." He cleared his throat. "Yes, I know. The development group is aware of the current use. And they don't care." He didn't answer that directly. "The sale closes in 60 days, he said instead. "December 3rd. The agreement requires vacant possession by 60 days, Evelyn repeated. "Yes, ma'am." She stood there on the porch of the building she'd spent 11 years holding together with stubbornness and stretched budgets, and the particular kind of love that shows up in chore charts and dentist appointments and learning, which child slept with the light on and which needed the window cracked, and which woke screaming at 2 in the morning and needed someone to sit with them until the dark stopped feeling dangerous. 60 days. She looked down at the envelope in her hands, then back up at Henry Ashford. "Was this decision difficult for you?" she asked. Not sharp, not accusatory. She genuinely wanted to know. His jaw shifted slightly. "My father left significant debt," he said. There were limited options." She nodded once. "Thank you for coming in person," she said. Because that much was true. He could have sent a letter. He could have had a lawyer call. He'd driven out here in his good coat on a cold morning and stood at the bottom of her steps and looked uncomfortable. And that at least was something. She went inside. She set the envelope on the kitchen counter. Then she turned back to the stove because the oatmeal was starting to stick, and 14 children were going to come downstairs in the next 20 minutes, and they needed to eat breakfast. She stirred the oatmeal. Her hands were completely steady. She didn't cry until she was alone in the bathroom 4 minutes later, running the tap so no one would hear. She told the children that evening she had considered waiting, buying herself a few days to think, to make calls, to try to find some angle that might make the news softer before it arrived. But she'd been living with these children long enough to know that secrets in that house didn't keep. They never had. Kids had a radar for the thing the adults weren't saying, and the silence around an unspoken trouble always landed heavier than the truth. So after supper, while the dishes were still stacked and the younger ones were still sticky-fingered from the apple slices she'd put out, Evelyn sat them all down in the main room. 14 children. Ages ranged from 6-year-old Dottie, who still sucked her thumb when she thought nobody was watching, to 17-year-old Sam, who sat apart from the group the way he always did. Not hostile, exactly, just separate, with his long arms crossed and his dark eyes watching Evelyn from beneath the fringe of his uncombed hair. There were the younger ones, Dottie and her best friend Clara, both 6. Peter and James, the twins, 7, identical in appearance and completely opposite in personality. Rosie, 8, who collected rocks and organized them by size on the windowsill above her bed. Tommy, 9, who was loud enough to fill any room he walked into. And quiet, thoughtful Wren, also 9, who was the first to notice when something was wrong and the last to say anything about it. The middle cluster, May and Lou, both 10, best friends since the day they'd arrived within a week of each other and decided to be inseparable. 11-year-old Eddie, who could take apart any mechanical thing he found and sometimes put it back together. 12-year-old Charlie, who had the gift of saying the exact wrong thing at the exact wrong moment but meant well every time. And Annie, 13, who had been at the orphanage longer than any child except Sam, and who had developed over those years an almost preternatural sensitivity to Evelyn's emotional state. She was already watching Evelyn's face with that careful, measuring look she got when she knew something was coming. And Sam, 17, nearly 18, old enough to understand things the others couldn't, old enough for that to be its own kind of burden. Evelyn told them. She kept it simple. She didn't dress it up or soften it to the point of distortion because they deserved more than comfortable lies. She told them that the building had been sold, that they had 60 days, and that she was going to fight as hard as she could to find a solution, but that she thought they should know. The room went very quiet. Dottie looked at Clara. Clara looked at her shoes. Tommy, who always had something to say, said nothing. "Where would we go?" Rosie asked. She asked it the way children ask questions they already suspect have bad answers, carefully, with a kind of braced quality, like she was preparing for the landing. "I'm working on that," Evelyn said. "I'm going to make calls tomorrow. There are options." "Would we stay together?" Annie asked. Her voice was flat, which was worse than if it had been scared. Evelyn held her gaze. "I'm going to try everything I can." "But would we?" Annie pressed. The silence that followed was about 2 seconds long. It felt much longer. "I don't know yet," Evelyn said, because she wasn't going to lie to them. She refused. Annie nodded once, very slowly. Then she stood up and walked upstairs without another word, and the sound of her footsteps on the old staircase was the loneliest sound Evelyn had heard in years. That night, Dottie didn't sleep. She knocked on Evelyn's door at midnight, at 2, and again at 3:15, each time without saying anything, just standing there in her nightgown looking at Evelyn with enormous eyes until Evelyn let her in and let her sleep in the armchair in the corner. Sam said nothing at all. He was gone the next morning before breakfast, and when he came back around noon, he sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the grain of the wood for a long time. Evelyn set a cup of tea beside him. He didn't touch it for 40 minutes. Then he picked it up, drank it, and went back upstairs. That was Sam. That was the whole vocabulary of Sam's pain, and Evelyn understood every word of it. The next 2 weeks were a kind of controlled desperation. Evelyn made calls, she wrote letters, she drove to 3 different county offices, waited in chairs that were designed to be slightly too uncomfortable to encourage lingering, and made her case to men and women behind desks who listened with the specific attentiveness of people who had already decided before she walked in. She contacted 3 nonprofit housing organizations. 2 never called back. The 3rd sent a form letter. She reached out to every wealthy family in the county she'd ever had occasion to meet, people who attended charity galas and put their names on library wings, and described themselves at dinner parties as committed to the community. Every one of them had a reason. This wasn't a good time. Their charitable giving was already allocated for the year. The economy was uncertain. They'd send a check for something smaller if she wanted. She visited Councilman Davies, who represented this part of the county and who had shaken her hand at an event 2 years ago and said that what she was doing was remarkable. He was sympathetic. He was very, very sympathetic. He offered her a brochure about relocation assistance programs. The one person who was openly hostile was Beatrice Hartley, who sat on the town's civic planning board and had, for reasons Evelyn had never fully understood, held a low-grade antagonism toward the orphanage since before Evelyn had even arrived. Beatrice was the first person in town to openly say what others were thinking more quietly, that the building could be better used, that the county already had services for orphaned children, that it wasn't 1920 anymore, and perhaps the whole model was outdated. Evelyn sat across from her in the planning board office and heard all of this delivered in the warm, reasonable tones of a person who had convinced herself that her convenience and progress were the same thing. "I appreciate your candor," Evelyn said when she was done. Beatrice smiled. "Of course. I think you've done wonderful work. I really do." Evelyn drove home. She sat in the parked car in front of the orphanage for a few minutes, looking at the building, at the crooked shutter and the faded paint and the vegetable garden and the light on in the upstairs window of the room that Annie shared with May and Lou. She could see the shadow of someone moving past the window. Annie, probably, pacing the way she did when she was trying to work through something in her head. Evelyn gripped the steering wheel. "Okay," she said aloud, to no one. "Okay, think." She went inside. She made soup. Garrett Hale arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the envelope. He didn't call ahead. He didn't announce himself in any particular way. Evelyn opened the front door in response to a knock and found him standing on the porch with a cord of firewood stacked on his truck bed and a look on his face like someone who had heard something he thought deserved a response. She knew who he was, vaguely. He owned a ranch about 4 miles out, Hale Ranch, 300 acres, a working cattle operation that he ran alone with one part-time hand. She'd seen him at the feed store, at the diner once. She knew his name the way you know the names of people in a small town, which is to say, she knew the name and not much else. I was maybe 44, 45. Broad through the shoulders in the way of men who actually used their bodies for their work rather than exercise. Sun-darkened face with the lines of someone who had spent significant portions of his life squinting. Quiet eyes. Brown hair that was starting to silver at the temples. He was very specifically not the kind of man who talked a lot. "Mr. Hale," Evelyn said. "Heard you might be needing firewood," he said. "Winter's coming early. I had extra." She looked at him for a moment. Yes. Actually, yes, that's very kind." He nodded, went back to the truck, started unloading. Evelyn watched him for a second, processing the unexpected fact of someone just doing a thing without being asked and without apparent expectation. And then she went to get her jacket and helped him carry wood around to the side of the house. They didn't talk much while they worked. Tommy came out to watch, and then, as Tommy always did, inserted himself into whatever was happening and started carrying smaller pieces in both arms with an expression of fierce concentration. Eddie appeared behind him and started asking Garrett questions about the truck. Garrett answered Eddie's questions in short, patient sentences without stopping working. When the wood was stacked and the truck was empty, Evelyn offered coffee. Garrett said he didn't want it to impose. "It's coffee," Evelyn said. "You brought us a cord of firewood. Come in." He came in. The kitchen that evening was, as it usually was around 5:30, a specific kind of controlled chaos. Supper was on the stove. Rosie was at the table working on a school project that appeared to involve an alarming amount of glitter. The twins were arguing about something that had started, from what Evelyn could gather, as a dispute over a board game and had evolved into a full philosophical disagreement about the nature of rules. Dottie was sitting on the counter eating an apple and watching everything with the placid expression of a child who finds the chaos of others deeply soothing. Garrett stood in the middle of all of it. He didn't look overwhelmed. He didn't look charmed in that slightly performative way some visitors did, like they were narrating their own experience of a charming place. He just looked at it all with those quiet eyes, taking it in, like a man reading the weather. Evelyn set a mug in front of him, He sat at the table and drank his coffee while Rosie explained her glitter project to him in considerable detail, and he listened to every word of it as though it was information he genuinely needed. He left around 7:30, after the younger children were getting ready for bed and the house was shifting into its evening rhythm. He shook Evelyn's hand at the door, not with any particular formality, just the way people who work with their hands tend to default to handshakes as a kind of straightforward sincerity. "Thank you," Evelyn said, "for the firewood." "Not a problem," he said. He came back on Friday with a caulking gun and spent an hour and a half fixing the gaps around the upstairs bathroom window without being asked. He came back the following Tuesday with bread from the bakery in town. 3 loaves, still warm, the kind the younger children loved, and a box of crackers, and a bag of apples. He didn't make a production of any of it. He dropped things off the way you drop mail through a slot, practically, without ceremony. By the end of the month, he was just there. The children absorbed him the way children absorb safe things, gradually and then completely. It started with the younger ones, as it always does. Dottie and Clara were the first to simply exist in whatever room he was in without paying any special attention to him, which is a child's way of indicating full acceptance. Tommy attached himself to Garrett's elbow whenever he appeared and narrated everything he was doing and asked questions without stopping for answers. Rosie showed him every new rock she found. Eddie was fascinated by Garrett's truck and by the general universe of mechanical things that Garrett seemed to move through naturally, and within 2 weeks they were spending Saturday mornings in the driveway with the hood up, Eddie asking questions and Garrett answering them, and occasionally handing tools over without having to explain which one. Annie was cautious. She watched him from a distance with that careful evaluating look of hers, and she didn't warm up fast. But one evening she'd sat down across from him at the kitchen table while he was reviewing what appeared to be some kind of livestock health record, and she'd said very directly, "Why do you keep coming back?" And he'd looked up from the papers and said, "Because it needs doing." And something about the simplicity of that answer seemed to satisfy her in a way that a more elaborate explanation wouldn't have. She'd started acknowledging him in the mornings after that. Not warmly, exactly, but with that particular acknowledgement that teenagers deploy when they've decided someone is acceptable. And Sam was the hardest case. Sam had been at the orphanage since he was 8 years old. He'd arrived with almost nothing, and with a look in his eyes that Evelyn, in her worst moments of private honesty, described to herself as feral, not wild, not aggressive, but with that quality of an animal that has been hurt enough times that it had developed an economy of trust. He gave it to nobody unless they'd spent a long, long time proving they weren't a threat. He had given it to Evelyn eventually. It had taken 2 full years and a lot of silences and a lot of meals set in front of him, without comment, and a lot of nights of lying quietly outside a closed door and saying nothing until a voice on the other side said, finally, "You can go to sleep, I'm okay." But he'd given it to her, and she had guarded it accordingly. He was not, to put it plainly, in the market for another person. He tolerated Garrett, the way a cat tolerates a new household arrangement, with visible reservations and a lot of watching from doorways. It changed because of a boot. Sam's work boots, the ones he wore for outdoor chores, had developed a split in the leather of the right boot, and the lace on the left had snapped and been replaced with a thin piece of rope that wasn't really doing the job. Evelyn had been meaning to get him new laces for a week and kept forgetting, which was unlike her and which she'd felt guilty about. One morning Sam came down to breakfast and found, beside his plate, a new leather bootlace. Dark brown. The right width. He looked at it. He looked around the kitchen. Evelyn was at the stove. He didn't ask. But Evelyn had been awake at 5:30 that morning and had heard Garrett moving quietly in the kitchen around 6. And when she'd come down 20 minutes later, his coffee mug was in the dish rack, and Sam's boots were on the mat by the back door where they always sat, both of them neat and repaired. The split in the right boot carefully sewn with waxed thread, the left boot fitted with the new lace. Sam picked up the bootlace at breakfast, turned it over in his fingers once, set it back down. He didn't say anything about it. But that evening, when Garrett settled into his usual chair at the kitchen table with his coffee, he found a blue ceramic mug next to his, a chipped one, with a small star painted on the side that had faded to almost nothing. It was Sam's mug, the one he'd kept on the shelf above his bed since he'd found it at a yard sale when he was 10. Garrett looked at the mug. He looked at Sam's empty chair. He said nothing. He drank from his usual coffee mug. But the next morning, the blue mug was in his regular spot at the table, already filled with coffee, and Garrett sat down in front of it without comment and drank from it like it was perfectly normal. Sam noticed. He didn't say anything. But at supper that evening, he sat at the kitchen table 2 chairs closer to where Garrett was sitting instead of his usual spot at the far end. It was a distance of maybe 3 feet. It was everything. Oh. Evelyn noticed all of this happening and felt, in response to it, a complicated and inconvenient feeling that she mostly tried not to examine too closely. She was practical by nature and by necessity. She had been the person responsible for this household for 11 years. And that responsibility had long since burned away most of the useless things. The worrying about what people thought, the second-guessing of decisions once they'd been made, the tendency toward sentiment that had complicated her 20s. What remained was her, efficient, warm in a no-nonsense way, deeply loving in the practical language of made meals and repaired things and remembered details. She had been alone, romantically, she meant, for a long time. There'd been a relationship 6 years ago. A man named David who'd come through town for work and stayed through the winter, but he'd ultimately wanted her to want different things than she wanted. And they'd ended it with the mutual sorrow of people who liked each other a great deal, but couldn't fix the fundamental misalignment. She hadn't tried again after David. Not seriously. The house consumed most of her, and she'd made a kind of peace with that. So the inconvenient feeling she was having about Garrett Hale was inconvenient partly because she hadn't been expecting it, and partly because she could see, very clearly, that it wasn't going anywhere good. Not because of who he was. He was, in fact, showing every indication of being exactly who he appeared to be, which was itself somewhat disorienting. But because her house was 60 days from dissolution, and she had too many real and pressing problems to be noticing how someone's hands looked when they were repairing a shutter. She told herself this very sternly, on a fairly regular basis. She noticed his hands repairing shutters anyway. The town of Clover Falls had a visible and audible response to Garrett's increasing presence at the orphanage, and that response was, in aggregate, unkind. It started with Miriam Delaney. Miriam was the widow of a reasonably wealthy farmer, well-preserved, well-connected, and the keeper of a personal opinion about Garrett Hale that she deployed periodically at social gatherings. She had, for reasons the town accepted without examination, considered Garrett a reasonable prospective match since her husband's passing. She had dropped hints. Garrett, who was either oblivious to hints or very good at choosing which ones to receive, had continued moving through life as if these hints did not exist. When Miriam heard, via the very efficient channel of small-town observation, that Garrett was spending time at the Mercer orphanage, she was not pleased. She did not become unpleasant in any direct or confrontational way. She was too skilled for that. She became unpleasant in the way accomplished gossips always do, through suggestion, through eyebrow, through the artful pause deployed at the right moment in a conversation. Within a week, the suggestion that Evelyn Mercer was using Garrett Hale had moved through the social fabric of Clover Falls with the particular speed of an idea that flatters the people who spread it. It landed in different versions in different ears. She was after his ranch. She needed money. She'd manufactured the crisis to attract a provider. She was clever and he was naive. Other versions of the gossip were less sympathetic to Garrett. He was throwing himself away on a cause that wasn't his. He was a grown man making choices that would leave him with nothing, while Evelyn Mercer walked away with everything. The children were, and this one made Evelyn's hands clench when she heard it, not even hers. She heard all of this, in fragments and whispers, the way you always hear these things in a small town, through the gap in a conversation that stops when you walk into a room, through a well-meaning friend who tells you, just so you know what people are saying, through the specific coolness in a shopkeeper's manner that had been warmer before. Evelyn heard it. She didn't bend. What she was aware of, underneath the anger, was a familiar exhaustion. The exhaustion of being a woman who had made choices that didn't fit the expected shape, and being required to defend those choices on a continuous and ongoing basis to people who had never been asked to defend theirs. She did not, however, say any of this to Garrett. She wasn't sure what Garrett had heard or what he thought about it, and she wasn't going to be the one to introduce the topic. He was an adult. He made his own choices. She was not going to manage his life for him. She was, if she was being honest with herself, also afraid that if she acknowledged it aloud, it would become a real thing that required a real conversation, and she was not sure she was ready for that conversation. 3 weeks before the 60-day deadline, Evelyn sat alone at the kitchen table after midnight with the orphanage's financial records spread out in front of her and ran the numbers for what was probably the 14th time that month. They didn't get better no matter how many times she ran them. The donation base had been declining for 2 years. Not dramatically, but steadily, the natural entropy of charitable giving when nothing dramatic is happening to remind people of a cause. The county subsidy had been reduced in the last budget cycle. There were 3 outstanding repair bills she'd been servicing at minimum payments because she couldn't afford to pay them down. The heating costs for the coming winter were going to be brutal. And now the property. Even if she found another building, she'd made inquiries, had 3 she was looking at, the move itself would cost money she didn't have, and every building she'd found had problems that the orphanage's current operating budget couldn't fix. She heard the floorboard creak and looked up to find Garrett in the kitchen doorway. He lived close enough to make it practical to stay late sometimes, particularly when he was working on a project that ran past evening. He'd spent that week addressing a structural issue with the back porch that had been on Evelyn's mental list for 2 years. He'd been there until past 10 doing the finish work, and she'd assumed he'd gone home. Apparently not. He looked at the papers on the table. He looked at her face. "Sit down," he said. It wasn't an order. It was the kind of thing someone says when they can tell the person they're looking at is white-knuckling something that doesn't need to be white-knuckled alone. She sat back in her chair. He sat down across from her, the way he always did. He looked at the papers. "Can I?" he said, gesturing. She pushed them toward him. He sat and read them. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her cold coffee mug and watched him read. The kitchen was very quiet. The house settled around them, full of the sleeping sounds of 14 children. That particular still quality a full house has at midnight that's different from any other kind of stillness. Garrett read for a long time. He turned pages carefully, went back once to check a number against a figure on another page. He didn't say anything while he read. Finally, he set the last page down and looked up at her. "You've been holding this place together with stubbornness," he said. Something about the directness of it made her laugh. A short, involuntary sound, more exhale than laugh. "Mostly stubbornness," she said. He almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that lives in the corner of a person's eye more than in their mouth. She'd seen it a few times. It startled her every time. "What's your honest read?" she asked. "Not kind, honest." He looked at the papers again. "You're losing," he said. "On the current trajectory. You know that already." "Yes." "But you're still fighting." "Yes." He picked up one of the pages, the account summary, and looked at it for another moment. Something in his expression had shifted, the way an expression shifts when a person moves from reading information to thinking about something larger than the page in front of them. Evelyn noticed. She wanted to ask what he was thinking. She didn't, because the particular quality of what was on his face was the kind of thing that felt like it needed space around it, and she didn't want to disturb whatever was happening there with a question. He set the page down. "How long have you been doing this alone, Lum?" he asked. Not the orphanage. He'd asked about that before. He meant this. The table in the middle of the night, the numbers that didn't add up, the weight of it. Evelyn looked at the coffee mug in her hands. "Since Margaret died," she said. "So, 4 years." He nodded. A silence settled. Outside, the wind moved through the oak trees along the fence line. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Wren, probably, who had a habit of midnight trips to the bathroom. "I'm not going to stop looking," Evelyn said, to herself as much as to him. "There are still options I haven't—" "I know," Garrett said. "The council meeting in 3 weeks. I know. I'm not done fighting this." He looked at her steadily. "I know you're not," he said. And then, "Get some sleep." She wanted to argue. She was tired enough that she didn't. She gathered the papers into a pile. Garrett stood and took his coffee mug to the sink, rinsed it, set it in the rack. Normal, careful, unhurried. As if this was just a kitchen and they were just 2 people at the end of a regular evening. He paused at the doorway. "Evelyn." She looked up. "You're not alone in this," he said. He left. Evelyn sat in the empty kitchen for a while after the sound of his truck faded. She didn't think about what he'd meant by it. She didn't let herself pull at that thread. She looked at the cup shelf on the wall above the counter. Margaret had started collecting cups years ago. Mismatched ones, each one with a small history. There were 15 of them. She went upstairs. She didn't sleep for a long time, but she lay in the dark with her eyes closed and her breathing slowed. And outside the wind moved through the oaks, and upstairs 14 children slept in the house that had been their home, and might not be much longer, and the whole building breathed around her with the particular life of a place that was loved. That frightened her more than the eviction notice ever had. Not the possible end of it. The fact that, somewhere in the last several weeks, she had stopped facing it alone. And how much, without ever having asked for it, she had come to need that. The blue mug stayed in Garrett's spot at the table. Nobody moved it. Nobody mentioned it. It simply became a fact of the kitchen the way most facts in that house became facts. Not through announcement, but through repetition, through the quiet accumulation of days, until the thing that was new became the thing that had always been there. By the second week of November, if someone had accidentally set the blue mug in the wrong place, At least 4 children would have corrected the error without being asked. Sam noticed that nobody moved it. He noticed in the particular sideways manner that Sam noticed everything, not by looking directly at the thing, but by registering it in his peripheral awareness and filing it somewhere internal. He still sat 2 chairs closer to Garrett at supper than he used to. He still didn't say much, but the quality of his silence had shifted in a way Evelyn could feel more than describe. It used to be a silence with walls in it. Now it was just quiet. Garrett, for his part, behaved as if none of this was remarkable in any way, which was probably the exact right response. He was there most evenings now. Not all of them. He had a ranch to run, animals to feed, the 1,000 daily obligations of a working cattle operation. And there were nights when Evelyn noticed his absence the way you notice a draft from a window that had previously been closed. She didn't examine that noticing too carefully. She had more than enough to examine. What she did notice, because she was observant by training and by nature, was how differently each child existed around him. Tommy talked at him constantly, and Garrett absorbed it like a landscape absorbs weather, present, unmoved, occasionally responsive. Eddie's Saturday morning truck sessions had expanded to include a general education in tools and mechanics that Eddie was cataloging with the intensity of a dedicated scholar. Rosie had started leaving rocks on the porch railing on the evenings he was expected, and he'd taken to picking one up and turning it over in his palm before setting it back, which was apparently the right response because she never said anything, but her ears went pink with satisfaction every time. The older girls were more measured. May and Lou had decided, through their private bilateral process of evaluation, that he was acceptable, and demonstrated this by simply including him in conversations they were already having, not directing remarks at him specifically, but not excluding him either, the way you include furniture you like in the general atmosphere of a room. Annie remained watchful. She'd softened from her initial guardedness, but she was 13 and she understood more than the younger children did about what was at stake. And she had a habit of sitting slightly apart during evenings and watching the room with an expression that Evelyn recognized because she saw it in the mirror sometimes. It was the expression of someone who wants very badly to trust something and is afraid of what it will cost them when it doesn't hold. Evelyn understood that expression. She just couldn't fix it. Not yet. What she could fix, what she was trying to fix, what she was spending every available hour attempting to fix, was the matter of the orphanage itself. The town council meeting was on the 14th of November, and Evelyn had prepared for it the way she prepared for most things that mattered, thoroughly, practically, with a specific and unromantic assessment of what she was walking into. She had a formal presentation. She had letters of support from 3 community organizations. She had a petition with 212 signatures, which she'd gathered herself over 2 weeks by standing outside the post office and the grocery store and asking people directly, face to face, which was harder and more effective than an online form. She also had, very clearly and honestly, a low expectation of success. Not because her case wasn't good, her case was solid, but she'd been in Clover Falls long enough to understand the specific gravitational field that money exerted on civic decision-making. And Edwin Porter, the developer behind the hotel project, was not a man who left loose ends. He'd been to town twice in the past month. Both times he'd met with council members. Both times those meetings had been described in the council minutes, which were public, as informal consultations regarding economic development opportunities. She drove to the meeting alone. Garrett had offered to come, and she'd almost said yes before she'd caught herself and said no, instead, thank you. She didn't fully understand why she'd said no. Something about not wanting whatever happened in that room to become entangled with whatever was happening between her and Garrett, which was a thing she was not prepared to name, but also could not pretend didn't exist. The council chambers smelled like old wood and carpet cleaner, and the particular indoor stuffiness of a room that didn't get enough ventilation. 8 people sat behind the curved table at the front. Evelyn knew all of their faces. She'd spoken to most of them individually over the past month. Councilman Davies gave her a small, encouraging nod when she came in, which she filed under well-intentioned and ultimately useless. Edwin Porter was not in the room. His lawyer was. She recognized him from the county courthouse, a compact, precise man named Whitfield, who had the specific quality of a person who is paid to make complicated things sound simple and simple things sound impossible. He sat in the front row of the gallery with a leather folder on his knee and the settled patience of someone who had already read the ending. Evelyn stood at the podium. She made her case. She had 12 minutes by the agenda clock, and she used all of them carefully. No emotional appeals, because she'd learned the hard way that emotional appeals in civic rooms tended to make men straighten in their chairs and become more formal, not less. She talked numbers. She talked community investment. She talked about the 14 children who would require county services, expensive county services, if the orphanage closed and placement was required. She talked about property tax implications and the hospitality sector's historical performance in comparable small towns, and she cited 3 studies and 2 examples. And she was, if she was being honest with herself, very good. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Whitfield spoke from the front row, and he was exactly as smooth as she'd expected. He didn't argue with her numbers. He expanded them. He talked about construction jobs and tourist revenue and the hotel's projected contribution to the tax base. He talked about the county's existing placement infrastructure for displaced children as though it were a robust and fully resourced system rather than the chronically underfunded and overburdened thing it actually was. He talked for 9 minutes. The council voted. It wasn't close. 5-2 in favor of allowing the sale to proceed. Davies voted against. Councilwoman Reyes, who had 3 children of her own and who had looked at Evelyn during the presentation with an expression of genuine anguish, voted against. The other 5 voted for it in the careful, slightly averted way of people who had already made their peace with the decision and just needed to get through the formality of making it official. Evelyn thanked the council. She gathered her papers. She walked out of the chamber into the cold November air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching her breath fog in front of her. 30 days left. She drove home. She sat in the car again, in the driveway, in the dark. Through the front window, she could see the kitchen light on and the movement of people inside. The familiar silhouette shapes of children she knew by the particular way they moved, by the height and posture of them. And then the broader, steadier shape of Garrett at the counter, apparently doing dishes. He'd stayed to do dishes. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went inside. The kitchen smelled like the vegetable soup that had been supper, and the faint lingering warmth of the day's use. Most of the children had been moved through bath and bed already. She could tell by the reduced noise level and by the fact that only Annie and Sam were still visible. Annie at the table doing homework, and Sam sitting in the window seat with a book that he probably wasn't reading. Garrett looked over his shoulder when she came in. He read her face the way he read most things, quickly, without comment. "Counsel?" he said. 5-2, she said. She set her bag on the counter, kept her voice flat. Annie looked up from her homework. Something moved across her face, young and unguarded for just a moment, the pure, unfiltered expression of someone absorbing a blow they'd been bracing for but hoping wouldn't land. Then she put it away behind the careful 13-year-old composure she'd spent years developing. "What does that mean?" Annie asked. Her voice was very controlled. "It means we keep looking," Evelyn said. "It means we haven't stopped yet." "But the vote wasn't the last thing that can happen," Evelyn said. "It just means the timeline is what it is. 30 days. We work with 30 days. Annie looked at her for a long moment, measuring, deciding whether to push or to let it go. She let it go. She dropped her eyes back to her homework, but her pencil didn't move. Sam said nothing. He was looking at the dark glass of the window rather than the book in his hands, and Evelyn could see his jaw set in that particular way of his. Not anger exactly, but the closest thing to it. The specific tension of someone who has had the floor dropped from under them enough times that their body knows the feeling before their mind does. Evelyn made tea. She set a mug in front of Annie and one on the window seat beside Sam without comment. Sam looked at it for a moment and then picked it up. She sat at the table. Garrett finished the dishes. He dried his hands on the kitchen towel and turned around, leaning against the counter with his arms loosely crossed, looking at the room. Not saying anything, just present. Eventually Annie finished her homework, packed her bag with the specific controlled efficiency she used when she was upset and managing it, said goodnight without her usual questions, and went upstairs. Sam stayed in the window seat until his tea was gone. Then he closed his book, set it on the seat, and looked at Evelyn. "We're going to lose it, aren't we?" he said. Not a question, an assessment. Evelyn looked at him steadily. He was 17. He deserved the truth. "I don't know," she said. "I'm still fighting, but I'm not going to lie to you and tell you it looks good right now." Sam absorbed this. His jaw did the thing again. Then he said very quietly, so that it was almost not a sentence at all, "I'm not going anywhere." It was unclear whether he meant it as a statement about himself or a declaration of intent regarding the house. Evelyn decided it was both. I know, she said. He went upstairs. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the November wind was picking up, the kind that came from the north and meant real cold was on its way. You did everything right tonight, Garrett said from the counter. For them, the way you handled it when you came in. I did what needed doing, Evelyn said. That's what I said. She looked at the table. It's not enough. Maybe not, he said, but it's not done yet. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that steady, unhurried quality he had, the quality that she had initially read as simply a quiet personality and had gradually understood was something more than that. It was the quality of a person who had learned, through some specific private history she didn't know, to be patient with hard things, to sit with them rather than rush around them. Why are you still here, Garrett? She asked. She hadn't meant to ask it. It came out before she'd decided to say it, the way things sometimes do late at night when the armor of the day has worn down. He was quiet for a moment. Because I want to be, he said. That's not much of an answer. It's the true one. She studied him. He was leaning against her kitchen counter in the late-night quiet of her house with a dish towel hanging from his hand, and he looked like someone who knew exactly where he was and had no particular interest in being anywhere else. And she found that fact, the simplicity and the weight of it, profoundly difficult to look at directly. The things people are saying in town, she said. He shrugged once. People say things. They're saying I'm using you. I know what they're saying. And? He looked at her with those even brown eyes. Do you think you're using me? He asked. No, she said immediately. Then it doesn't matter what they think, he said, and he said it so flatly, without defensiveness or performance, that there was nothing to argue with in it. Evelyn was quiet. Go to sleep, he said. You sound like a broken record, she said. Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, not quite tenderness, but in the territory of both. You sound like someone who hasn't slept more than 5 hours in 3 weeks, he said. That was accurate. She didn't concede it out loud. He left. She listened to his truck back out of the drive, the sound of it fading down the road into the dark. The house was still around her, and then a floorboard moved upstairs, someone rolling over in a bed or padding to the bathroom, and then still again. She sat at the table for another few minutes. Then she looked at the cup shelf. 15 cups. Mismatched, each with its own small history. Margaret's collection, carried on. She looked at them for a long time. Then she got up, went to the cabinet where she kept the random accumulation of donated kitchenware that didn't have an established place, and after a moment of searching found a 16th cup, plain, white, slightly too large, with a small chip on the rim that wasn't a problem. She set it on the shelf at the end of the row. She didn't think too carefully about why she did it. She turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. Sleep, when it finally came, was dreamless and deep. The sleep of someone who has held something difficult long enough that the body simply stops waiting for permission to let go. Downstairs, 16 cups sat on the shelf in the dark. Outside, the wind pushed hard through the oak trees, stripping the last leaves from the branches, and the cold that was coming settled itself over Clover Falls like a decision that had already been made, patient, absolute, and waiting to be understood. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Evelyn found it in his mailbox at 7:40 in the morning, wedged between a utility bill and a grocery store circular, wearing the unremarkable face of official correspondence, white envelope, county seal in the upper left corner, her name and address printed in the clean, indifferent font of a machine that didn't know or care what it was delivering. She stood at the end of the driveway in her coat, with her breath fogging in the cold air, and looked at it for a moment before she opened it. She already knew what it was. She'd been expecting it since the council vote. Knowing something is coming doesn't make it land any softer. It just means you've had longer to dread it. The letter was 2 paragraphs. Official language, legal references, a date printed in bold, December 3rd. The property transfer was finalized. Vacant possession required no later than the stated date. Failure to comply would initiate proceedings as outlined in Section 4 of the attached agreement, which she could find enclosed. She folded the letter back into the envelope. She walked back to the house. Inside, breakfast was happening. The usual Tuesday morning density of noise and movement, Tommy arguing about whether cereal counted as a real breakfast, Dottie crying because she couldn't find her left shoe, Eddie eating in silence while reading something propped against the milk carton. The ordinary, irreplaceable chaos of 14 people starting a day together. Evelyn set the letter on the counter, face down. She found Dottie's shoe under the radiator in the hallway. She poured Tommy a bowl of oatmeal and told him it was real breakfast. She reminded Eddie that reading at the table was fine, but the milk carton wasn't a bookstand. She didn't tell them. Not yet. Not at breakfast, not before school, not in the middle of the ordinary morning that still had to happen regardless of the envelope on the counter. She waited until that evening. She had told them once before, back in October, with the same deliberate honesty. No softening, no false comfort, just the truth in plain language. This time was different. This time the truth was no longer a possibility on the horizon. It had arrived. December 3rd was 30 days away, and it was real in a way it hadn't been before, and she could see the moment it became real for each of them register in their faces one by one as she spoke. Clara started crying quietly, the way 6-year-olds cry when they're trying not to. Big silent tears running down her face while she pressed her lips together in a thin line. Dottie watched Clara cry and then started crying too, not because she fully understood, but because Clara was her person, and when Clara hurt, Dottie hurt. That was just the nature of things. Tommy went very still, which was wrong. Tommy was never still. Tommy filled whatever space he occupied with constant motion and noise, and it was one of the things that could drive Evelyn to the edge of her patience, and also one of the things she loved about him without reservation. His stillness now was the stillness of a child absorbing a shock that was too big for his usual channels. "But we've been here our whole lives," he said. And then, as if correcting himself, "I mean, some of us have." "I know," Evelyn said. "This is our house," he said. His voice cracked on the last word, and he looked furious about that, the way 9-year-olds do when their emotions exceed their tolerance for showing them. "I know it is," Evelyn said. Annie sat at the edge of the group with her arms wrapped around herself. She wasn't crying. She had that flat, shut-down expression again, the one that meant she was somewhere behind her own face managing something too large for the room. When Evelyn looked at her, Annie looked back, and for a moment something raw and young and frightened moved through her eyes before she locked it back down. "Are we going to be separated?" she asked, and there it was, the question that lived underneath all the other questions. The thing every single child in that room was actually asking, in one form or another, because they all knew, in the particular bone-deep way of children who have already been abandoned once, that separated was the worst possible word. Evelyn looked at her. "I am doing everything I can to prevent that," she said. "That's not an answer," Annie said. "It's the most honest one I have right now." Annie stood up. She walked to the window and stood there with her back to the room, looking out at the dark yard, and she didn't speak again for the rest of the evening. Wren, quiet, thoughtful. Wren, who always noticed first and spoke last, was the one who came and took Evelyn's hand after the others had drifted. To tears, to silence, to the various private corners of their upset. She didn't say anything. She just held Evelyn's hand for about 30 seconds, and then let go and went upstairs. And that small, unremarkable gesture of comfort, child to adult, undid something in Evelyn's chest that she didn't fully allow herself to feel until much later that night, alone in the bathroom with the tap running. Sam was not there. Sam had been gone since school, which was not entirely unusual. He had a habit of long, solitary walks when something was building in him that needed space. But dinner came and went, and he didn't come back. And by 8 o'clock, Evelyn was standing at the front door looking out at the dark road with her arms crossed and a quiet, cold unease sitting in her stomach. He came back at 9:15, and she knew before he got close enough for the porch light to reach him. She knew from the set of his shoulders and the way he was moving, not hurt, not injured, but carrying something physical in his body. He came up the porch steps, and when he passed through the light, she saw the knuckles on his right hand, scraped raw, one of them still bleeding a little, sluggishly. She held the door open. He came inside. He stood in the hallway and didn't look at her. "Sam," she said. "I'm fine," he said. Preemptive, defensive. "You're bleeding." "It's nothing. Sit down." He didn't move for a moment. That familiar internal negotiation she'd watched him run 1,000 times. The one where he weighed the instinct to deflect against whatever thread of something else lived underneath it. Then he sat down on the hallway bench. She got the first aid kit from the bathroom, sat beside him. He let her take his hand. Not freely, exactly, but without resistance. And she cleaned the knuckles with antiseptic. He didn't flinch at the sting. He'd built up a considerable tolerance to minor pain over the years. "What happened?" she asked, keeping her voice level, not accusing. "Some guys from Fairview were in town," he said, "talking about the orphanage." She waited. "They were saying things," he said. "What kind of things?" His jaw tightened. "That it was good it was getting torn down, that the kids in it were—" He stopped. "Sam." "Trash," he said, flat, like reading a word off a page. "They said we were trash and the town was better off without us." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She finished wrapping his hand, pressed the tape down, held it for a second longer than was strictly necessary. "How many of them were there?" she asked. "3. "And you?" "2 of them," he said. "The other one ran." She looked at him. He was looking at the wall. "I'm not going to tell you it was the right thing to do," she said. "I know. But I understand why you did it." He looked at her then. Something in his face shifted. The barest movement, the thing that happened sometimes when Sam was surprised by being understood. "Are you angry?" he asked. "I'm worried," she said. "That's different." He looked back at this wall. "They were wrong," he said, "about us." "Yes," Evelyn said. "They were completely wrong." He sat there for another moment. Then he said so quietly it was almost not a sentence, "I'm not trash." "No," Evelyn said. "You are absolutely not." He nodded once, and something in him seemed to settle very slightly. Not all the way, not cleanly, because Sam never settled all the way. That wasn't how he worked. But enough. She sat with him until he went upstairs, and then she stood in the hallway and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and breathed. 30 days. She went to the kitchen and sat down. The letter was still on the counter where she'd left it, face down, as if inverting it changed anything. She turned it over and looked at it again. Then she set it aside and pulled out her notepad and started writing. The list she'd been maintaining since October, the one with every possible lead, every resource, every contact, every angle, crossed off one by one as each door closed. There were still 3 items without a line through them. She stared at those 3 items for a long time. The first was a small community foundation she'd written to 3 weeks ago and hadn't heard back from. Realistically, a long shot. They funded established organizations, not emergency interventions. The second was a local attorney named Prescott, who had been vaguely sympathetic when she'd spoken to him at a town event, and who she hadn't yet approached directly about the legal options. She'd been avoiding it because she already knew, from her own research, that the legal options were limited, but she hadn't yet heard it said out loud by someone who knew the law better than she did, and maybe, there was something she'd missed. The third item had Garrett's name written next to it, and then crossed out and written again, which told its own story about the conversations she'd been having with herself. She crossed out the third item again. Definitively this time. She wasn't going to ask him for money. She wasn't going to let whatever was between them become tangled up in financial desperation. She would not do that to him, and she would not do that to herself. She circled the attorney's name. She called him the next morning. Prescott was a decent man and a thorough one, and he spent 45 minutes on the phone with her going through the legal framework of the sale and the various mechanisms that might theoretically be used to challenge or delay it. At the end of 45 minutes, he said what she'd already suspected. The sale was clean. Roland Ashford's estate had been properly executed. Henry Ashford had clear authority to sell, and the development group's paperwork was without significant defect. There was no injunction available, no procedural challenge that wasn't purely delaying rather than stopping, and any delays would almost certainly be resolved in the developer's favor well before her resources for a legal fight were exhausted. "I was sorry." He said so twice. She thanked him and hung up. She sat in the office, the small room off the kitchen that she used as an administrative space, crammed with filing cabinets and a desk that was permanently buried under papers and the ancient computer that ran the accounting software, and looked at the ceiling. Then she went back out to the kitchen and made lunch because it was Tuesday, and on Tuesdays Wren and Rosie and the twins came home early from school, and they needed lunch. She was cutting bread when Garrett came in the back door, the way he usually came in, not knocking, because he'd stopped knocking weeks ago and she'd stopped expecting him to. He came in, took off his jacket, hung it on the hook. He looked at her face. "Attorney was a dead end?" he said. "Clean sale," she said. "No viable challenge." He nodded. He sat down at the table. "The foundation hasn't called back," she said. "I'll call them again today. And there's a county commissioner named Hartwell who Davies thinks might be sympathetic. I'm scheduled to speak with her Thursday, and I found a legal aid property organization out of the city that handles displacement cases. I sent them everything last week. They said they'd review it, but their caseload is... Evelyn, Garrett said. She stopped cutting bread. You know, none of those are going to work, he said. Not cruel, honest. She set the knife down. She pressed her palms flat on the counter and looked at the wall. I know, she said. That's not giving up, he said, knowing it. What is it then? Being honest about where you are, he said. So you can think about what's actually possible instead of what you wished was possible. She turned around. He was sitting at her kitchen table with his hands around his coffee mug, his morning ranch work still visible on him, the dust on his jacket, the particular tiredness in his face that came from being up since before light. He looked like a man who had driven 4 miles to sit at her kitchen table and say hard things to her and meant to. What's actually possible, she repeated. He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking, he said. About options, he said. That aren't on your list. She looked at him. Something in the way he said it, the specific quality of his stillness, something that wasn't quite hesitation, but was related to it, made a small, careful alarm sound somewhere in the back of her mind. Garrett, I'm not asking you to weigh in on it yet, he said. I'm telling you I'm thinking, that's all. What kind of thinking? He met her eyes. The kind that's mine to do, he said, not yours. She held his gaze for a long moment. The alarm in the back of her mind was still sounding. She had some idea, not the specific shape of it, not the detail, but the general country of it, what he might be thinking. And the thought of it made something in her chest tighten in a way she wasn't sure how to name. Not hope. Not yet. Something more like the physical sensation of standing at the edge of something very high and not knowing whether there is ground below. She wanted to ask him directly. She didn't, because he was right that it was his to do, not hers. And she had spent her whole adult life watching people mistake their fear for authority over someone else's choices, and she was not going to do that to him. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. She went back to cutting bread. The twins came home 20 minutes later, and the kitchen filled up again, and the morning's conversation receded into the ordinary motion of the day. Not forgotten, but set aside, the way you set a thing down carefully when you need your hands free for something else. But later, while Rosie and the twins were eating and Wren was telling a long, detailed story about something that had happened at recess involving a misidentified rock specimen, Evelyn looked across the kitchen and caught Garrett watching the children. Not with the observational quality he sometimes had, the reading the room quality. He was watching them the way a person watches something they are in the process of making a decision about. She looked away. She didn't ask. But that evening, after the younger ones were in bed and the house had settled into its night quiet, Sam came downstairs for water and found Garrett still at the table, just sitting there in the low kitchen light with an empty coffee mug and his hands loosely clasped on the table in front of him, staring at the middle distance with the concentrated stillness of a man working through something difficult. Sam got his water. He stood at the sink. You okay? Sam asked. He said it in the casual, deflecting register of a teenager who wants to ask something directly and isn't quite there yet. Garrett looked up. Yeah, he said. Sam drank his water, set the glass in the rack. You're going to do something, Sam said. Not a question. Garrett looked at him for a moment. Get some sleep, Garrett said. Sam looked back at him with those dark, careful eyes that had seen enough to be very good at reading the subtext of what adults said and didn't say. He stood there for another 3 seconds. Then he went back upstairs without another word. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the November wind was working its way under the eaves, finding the gaps, and the cold that had been coming for weeks had fully arrived now. Settled, committed, the kind that meant everything from here until March was going to be hard, in the basic physical way of winter in a drafty building with an aging furnace and 14 children who needed to be kept warm. Garrett sat at the table for a long time after Sam went upstairs. Then he stood up, rinsed his mug, and left. Evelyn heard his truck from her room, where she'd been lying awake in the dark. She heard it pull out of the driveway and go down the road, the sound of it fading north, in the direction of the ranch. She stared at the ceiling. 16 cups on the shelf downstairs. November cold pressing at the windows. 30 days on a clock that didn't care about any of it. She turned over, closed her eyes. Somewhere down the road, In a house she'd never been inside, Garrett Hale was thinking. She didn't know yet what he was going to do. She was afraid to hope. She hoped anyway, in the quiet dark of a house full of sleeping children, without permission, without certainty, and without any idea at all what it was going to cost him. Nobody in Clover Falls knew what Garrett Hale did on the Thursday morning before the final property meeting. He was up before 4. Not unusual. Ranch hours were ranch hours, and his body had been waking at that time for so long that an alarm clock had become a formality he'd stopped bothering with years ago. But on this particular Thursday, he wasn't up because of the animals, or because of any specific task that needed doing before sunrise. He was up because he hadn't really been asleep. He mud coffee. He stood at the kitchen window of his ranch house and drank it, while the dark outside slowly separated itself into the shapes of things. The fence line, the barn, the open pasture beyond, the long flat reach of his land under a sky still thick with stars. 300 acres. He'd bought the first 50 with the money left over after his father's funeral, which was almost nothing, and spent the next 16 years adding to it one hard negotiated parcel at a time. There wasn't a fence post on this property he hadn't put in himself, or paid for out of a season's work, and then felt the absence of that money through the following winter. He set his coffee mug in the sink. He went outside. It was bitter cold, the real cold of late November that carried no ambiguity about its intentions. He walked the fence line along the south pasture first, his breath coming out in long, slow clouds, boots breaking the thin crust of frost on the grass. He wasn't inspecting anything. He wasn't looking for breaks in the wire or problems with the posts. He was walking because he needed to move while he thought, and he'd always been that kind of person. Thoughts that needed to go somewhere found their way out through his feet. He walked the south pasture and then the east, where the land sloped slightly upward toward a ridge, and you could see, on a clear morning, 3 or 4 miles of the valley spread out below. He'd eaten lunch on that ridge more times than he could count. He'd sat up there the day his older brother died and not been able to cry, and then come back a month later and finally managed it, alone, with nobody watching. He'd sat up there during a drought year when the numbers were so bad, he'd written out a list of what he could sell without destroying the operation, and then sat with that list until he found a way to not need it. He walked the ridge, then the north field, where he ran cattle in the summer, then back along the western boundary, where the oak trees thickened near the road, and you could hear the creek if the wind was right. The whole circuit took 2 hours. His feet were cold. His hands were cold. He'd left his gloves on the kitchen table and hadn't gone back for them because that was the kind of morning it was. When he got back to the yard, he stood and looked at the barn for a while, then at the house, then at the land generally, the whole of it, the scope of what those 16 years had built. He'd been alone here for most of those years. That had been a choice, or at least he'd told himself it was a choice. There'd been a woman early on, before the ranch was really a ranch, when it was still mostly debt and intention. She'd left because the life was too hard and too isolated, and because Garrett was the kind of man who was easier to admire than to live alongside, and she hadn't been wrong about any of it. He'd understood her reasons even while the leaving hurt. After that, he'd folded in. Put everything into the land. The ranch became the relationship, demanding, consuming, returning what you gave it in the honest currency of sweat and seasons. He'd been fine with that. He thought he was fine with that. He went inside. He sat at the kitchen table. He opened the folder he'd put together over the past 2 weeks. The property valuation, the figures he'd gotten from a real estate contact, the rough estimate from the bank about what the land and the cattle operation and the equipment would bring in a properly structured sale. He'd been over these numbers so many times the pages were soft from handling. The figure at the bottom of the final page was big enough to do what needed doing. He closed the folder. He picked up his phone and called his real estate contact, a man named Burrows he'd worked with twice before, and told him he wanted to move forward. Burrows was quiet for a moment on the other end. "You sure about this, Garrett?" he said. "I'm sure," Garrett said. "It's a strong market right now, but this is fast. I mean, we can do it if you're sure, but..." "I'm sure," Garrett said again. Burrows said he'd start making calls. Garrett hung up. He sat at the table for another minute. Then he went to feed the cattle because they still needed feeding regardless of everything else. And that was just how mornings worked. He didn't tell Evelyn. I wasn't going to tell her. Not yet. Not before it was done. He'd thought about this carefully and had arrived at a clear conclusion. If he told her before it was settled, she would try to stop him. Not out of selfishness. out of the particular form of selflessness that Evelyn Mercer had weaponized against herself for 11 years, the habit of refusing things that might cost someone else anything at all. She would say it was too much, it wasn't his to carry, she couldn't accept it. She'd say it with real feeling and real conviction, and she'd be completely wrong, and they'd have a long, difficult conversation that would cost them both something and end with her not being able to stop him anyway because it was his land and his decision. Better to do it first. The property meeting was scheduled for November 28th at the county records office downtown. A procedural finalization of the sale, the last formal step before the deed transferred to Porter's development group. Evelyn knew about it. She'd been invited, nominally, as a formality. As the current occupant of the property, she had a right to be present. She'd told Garrett she was going, that she intended to make one final appeal to whoever was willing to hear it, and that she fully understood it was almost certainly not going to change anything. He'd told her he'd be there. She'd assumed he meant moral support. The meeting was at 2 in the afternoon. Garrett arrived at 1:55. The records office had a formal meeting room that got used for this kind of thing. Property transfers, estate proceedings, the occasional contract dispute. Long table, county seal on the wall, fluorescent lighting that flattened everything. It smelled like carpet and legal paper. A county clerk named Breneman sat at the head of the table with a stack of documents. Two of Porter's people were already there. The lawyer Whitfield, who Evelyn recognized from the council meeting, and a younger associate who was there to carry things and look efficient. Porter himself arrived at 2 o'clock. Evelyn had not met him before. She'd built a mental image over the weeks of hearing his name attached to the project, and the reality was close enough to that image to be unsurprising. He was in his mid-50s, expensive haircut, the kind of physical confidence that came from spending several decades having most situations resolve in his favor. He came in with his coat still on and shook Breneman's hand and didn't look at Evelyn immediately, which was a choice that told her something about how he'd decided to regard her presence. He looked at her eventually. A brief, assessing glance that he converted immediately into a small professional nod. "Ms. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Porter," she said. He sat down. His people sat down. Breneman opened his folder and began the procedural preamble, the recitation of document numbers and legal references that turned a building full of children's lives into a line item in a transfer record. Evelyn sat very straight in her chair. She had prepared a final statement. 2 minutes, written out, because she trusted herself less to stay controlled when she was ad-libbing in a room like this. She was going to read it, and she was going to be dignified, and she was going to look every person at that table in the eye while she did it. She was going to do this right, even though it wasn't going to work. The door opened. Garrett walked in. He was wearing a clean shirt and his good jacket, and he'd combed his hair, which was not something she'd ever actually seen before, and he was carrying a folder under his arm. He nodded to Evelyn, a single nod, meeting her eyes for a moment in a way that communicated something she couldn't immediately translate, and then pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. Porter glanced at him. "And you are?" "Garrett Hale," Garrett said. "I own property adjacent to this parcel." Porter's expression remained pleasant. Adjacent property owners had limited standing in transfer meetings, but weren't generally excluded. He glanced at Whitfield, who gave a small neutral shrug. "Mr. Hale," Breneman said, making a note. Evelyn looked at Garrett. He was looking at Breneman. She studied the side of his face, the set of his jaw, the quality of his stillness, that particular compression in his expression that she'd learned to read as the exterior of something significant happening underneath. She looked at the folder under his arm. Her chest tightened. Breneman began moving through the procedural items. Evelyn gave her statement when the moment came. Clean, direct, the 2 minutes she'd prepared, looking at each person at the table the way she'd planned. Porter listened with his hands flat on the table and his face arranged in polite attention, the expression of a man who has learned to look respectful while waiting for an obstacle to finish. When she was done, he said, "I appreciate your advocacy for these children, Ms. Mercer. This development will ultimately benefit the community they're a part of." The specific quality of that sentence, the smoothness of it, the way it absorbed her 11 years and 14 children into a talking point about community benefit, landed in the room and sat there. Garrett said, "I have a competing offer." The room changed. It was subtle. Nobody visibly startled. But something shifted in the quality of attention, the way a room shifts when a thing that was supposed to be settled turns out not to be. Breneman looked up from his papers. Porter's pleasant expression didn't disappear, but it recalibrated slightly. A small, involuntary adjustment, the face of a man deciding whether to take something seriously. "I'm sorry?" Brenneman said. Garrett opened the folder. He placed several pages on the table, spread them out in the precise, unhurried way of someone who had spent some time deciding how to do this. "I'm making a formal competing offer on this property," he said. "The figures are certified by my bank. The offer exceeds the current purchase agreement by 6%. He slid a copy toward Brenneman and another toward Porter's side of the table. Whitfield picked it up first. He looked at it. Something moved through his expression, too fast to read clearly, but Evelyn caught it. She looked at the page in front of Brenneman. She saw the number. Her breath went somewhere. She understood in that moment what she was looking at. Not abstractly, she'd suspected something, had been half afraid of something for weeks. But seeing it printed on a page in figures, the scale of it, it became concrete in a way the suspicion never had been. And the concrete weight of it hit her somewhere behind the sternum. She looked at Garrett. He was watching Porter. Porter looked at the page for a moment. Then he looked at Garrett with the careful, measuring expression of a man recalculating. "Mr. Hale," he said, "I appreciate the gesture, but my agreement with the Ashford estate is already signed." "Contingencies exist," Garrett said. "The clause is on page 4 of your agreement. Brenneman has the original. Competing offer within the notice period, submitted to the county recorder. The seller has the right to consider it." Whitfield was already at page 4. Porter's pleasantness had not left his face, but it was doing less work than it had been. "You're proposing to purchase an orphanage," he said. "For what purpose exactly?" "To ensure it keeps operating as one," Garrett said. A beat. Porter leaned back slightly. When he spoke again, the warmth in his voice had thinned. "That's a significant investment for a charitable impulse?" "It's my money," Garrett said. "What I do with it isn't your concern." "Is it actually your money?" Porter said. He let that hang for exactly 1 second before continuing. "Or is it a case of a man who's been spending a lot of time at this particular address, making some decisions that someone else has been, let's say, benefiting from?" The room was very quiet. Evelyn felt the blood leave her face. She knew exactly what he was implying, and she knew exactly where he'd gotten the raw material for it, from the same pool of town gossip that Miriam Delaney had been feeding for weeks. She started to speak. Garrett put his hand on the table, just laid it flat, palm down, not touching her, just a physical punctuation that said, "Wait." He looked at Porter. "You can say what you're implying directly," Garrett said. His voice hadn't changed at all. Not louder, not harder. Just exactly the same, which was somehow more effective than either. Porter smiled. "I'm simply suggesting that a man who has apparently become personally involved with the occupant of a property." "That's enough," Garrett said. "I'm just raising the question of—" "I heard what you raised," Garrett said. "I'm telling you it's enough." The specific flatness in those words, the total absence of performance in them, fell across the room like something physical. Whitfield had stopped talking. Porter's smile had not exactly disappeared, but it had become effortful. Evelyn looked at Porter and said, with the careful precision of someone choosing each word deliberately, "My history and my personal life are not relevant to a property transaction. If you have something to say about the legal standing of Mr. Hale's offer, say it. Otherwise, I'd suggest we keep this professional." Porter looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his calculation. The recognition, perhaps, that this particular line of attack wasn't going to produce the effect he'd been hoping for. He looked at Brenneman. "What's the procedural ruling on a competing offer at this stage?" Brenneman had been reading carefully. He was a thorough man, Brenneman, and he looked slightly uncomfortable with the temperature of the room, but he was also someone who took his procedural responsibilities seriously. "The clause Mr. Hale referenced is in the agreement," he said. "A competing offer formally submitted within the notice window is eligible for consideration by the seller's representative. Henry Ashford would need to be contacted." "Henry Ashford's representative is myself," Whitfield said. Everyone looked at Whitfield. He was reading the bank documents. He looked up. He looked at Porter. Something was happening in Whitfield's expression that was more complex than his usual controlled neutrality. The expression of a lawyer who is looking at solid numbers and doing a calculation that has more than one variable. "Mr. Porter," Whitfield said carefully, "the offer is financially sound." Porter looked at him. "It exceeds your current agreement," Whitfield continued, And Mr. Ashford's instructions to me were to achieve the best possible outcome for the estate. I would need to contact him. You work for me. I was retained by the estate, Whitfield said. I work for the estate. The silence that followed lasted maybe 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which Edwin Porter sat at that table and looked at the pages in front of him and understood that the thing he'd considered completely settled was no longer that. Fine, he said. The pleasantness was gone now. Contact him. Brenneman called a 15-minute recess. Evelyn and Garrett stood in the hallway outside the meeting room. She looked at him. He was looking at the wall with the expression of a man who had done what he'd planned to do and was now waiting to see how the physics of it resolved. Your ranch, she said. He looked at her. You sold your ranch, she said. It wasn't a question. She knew. The number on the page was the ranch. Not completely, he said. Burroughs found a buyer for the northern parcel and the cattle operation. I'm keeping the house and the immediate land. He paused. For now. She looked at him. That's still enough, he said. It's enough to do this. That's what matters. Garrett. She stopped, started again. That's 16 years. I know what it is, he said. Not defensive, just clear. You can't, Evelyn. He turned to face her properly, the way he did when he wanted to make sure something landed. It's already done. Burroughs has a signed agreement. The funds are certified. What's happening in that room right now is the last step. He held her gaze. Don't ask me to regret it. She looked at him for a long moment. Why? She said. And she meant it in the largest possible way. The whole question, everything underneath it, the real one. He was quiet for a moment. You know why, he said. She did know. That was the thing. She had known for weeks, in the way you know something you're not ready to say out loud. Felt it in the accumulated weight of mornings and suppers and late-night kitchens and the specific quality of his attention, which had never once been the attention of someone who was there for something simple. She knew why. She just wasn't ready to say it yet, standing in a fluorescent hallway outside a records office with her whole life, and 14 children's lives hanging on a phone call being made in a room 20 feet away. The door opened. Brenneman appeared. If you'll come back in, he said. They went back in. Whitfield was on his feet. Porter was sitting with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had been told something he didn't want to hear and was deciding what to do about it. Whitfield looked at Garrett. Mr. Ashford has accepted your offer, he said. Porter made a sound. The estate's position is that the higher offer represents a better outcome for the beneficiaries, Whitfield said, with the careful neutrality of a man who had done the legal math and arrived at the only defensible answer. We'll need to schedule execution of the new agreement. I can have my bank here by 4 o'clock, Garrett said. Brenneman looked at Porter. Mr. Porter, your deposit will be returned per the contingency terms. Porter stood up. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He looked at Garrett with an expression that had long since stopped performing any kind of pleasantness. You're making a mistake, he said. Noted, Garrett said. Porter left. Whitfield stayed to handle the paperwork. Brenneman opened a new folder with the particular relieved efficiency of a proceduralist who is glad the room temperature has dropped. Evelyn sat down. She sat because her legs had decided without consulting her that they'd been doing quite enough. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs under the table and breathed slowly through her nose and looked at the county seal on the wall while the room reorganized itself around the shape of what had just happened. Garrett sat beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She didn't cry. She came close. There was a specific pressure behind her eyes and at the back of her throat that she recognized and controlled, because she was not going to cry in the county records office in front of Whitfield and Brenneman and the young associate who was still taking notes in the corner. But her hand was on the table and Garrett's hand was beside it, and at some point, she couldn't have said exactly when, the edges of their fingers were touching, just barely, the minimal possible contact, and neither of them moved away from it. The paperwork took 2 hours. She signed her name 17 times on documents that transferred permanent ownership of the orphanage's property into the orphanage's operating trust, a structure Garrett had arranged with his bank and a property attorney, clean and solid, the kind of arrangement that would survive any future change in circumstances because it was the deed itself and not contingent on anything. When it was done, Brenneman handed her a copy of the final page. She looked at it, her name, the orphanage's name, the address, December 1st, and the date would stand. She folded it carefully and put it in her bag. Outside it was nearly dark, the short November afternoon already giving way, and the cold was the kind that pressed against your face the moment you stepped through a door. They walked out together into the parking lot and stood for a moment in the sharp air. "Come home," Evelyn said, "for supper." It wasn't a complicated invitation. It wasn't a declaration. It was just the thing she wanted, plainly said. "Yeah," Garrett said. "Okay." They drove separately. She got there first and she was taking off her coat in the hallway when she heard the sound of the house. Supper being negotiated in the kitchen, someone laughing, a chair scraping, the particular living noise of it. And she stood in the hallway for a moment and just let it wash over her. Still here. Still home. She went into the kitchen. She started cooking. And when she heard his truck pull up outside and the back door open and his jacket go on the hook and his footsteps cross the floor, she didn't turn around from the stove. But she was smiling. She was pretty sure he could tell. The news moved through Clover Falls the way all news moved through small towns, faster than anyone could have deliberately carried it, and with the particular distortion that happens when a story passes through enough mouths that people start adding the parts they assumed must have happened. By the next morning, most of the town knew that Edwin Porter's hotel project was dead. By noon, most of them knew that Garrett Hale had bought the property. The version that was most widely circulated held that he'd walked into the meeting and outbid Porter in some kind of dramatic confrontation, which was close enough to true that Evelyn didn't bother correcting the details when she heard it. What mattered was the result, and the result was the folded document in her coat pocket, which she had touched approximately 40 times since leaving the records office. Not to read it again, just to confirm it was still there, that it was real. The children found out that evening. She'd called them all into the main room after supper, same as October, same as November, standing in front of the same 14 faces she'd been standing in front of for years. But this time, the quality of what she had to tell them was entirely different, and she felt that difference in her chest before she said a single word. "The orphanage isn't closing," she said. The room was very quiet for exactly 1 second. Then Tommy made a sound that was somewhere between a shout and a sob, and completely defied categorization, and Dottie and Clara grabbed each other and started jumping, and the twins knocked over a chair that nobody bothered picking up for the next 20 minutes. And May and Lou held each other and laughed, and Rosie pressed both fists against her mouth, and her eyes went enormous and wet, and Wren, quiet, thoughtful Wren, sat perfectly still with tears running down her face, making no sound at all, which was somehow the most devastating and most beautiful thing in the room. Annie didn't move immediately. She sat where she was and looked at Evelyn with those careful, measuring eyes, and Evelyn could see her working through it, the mechanism of disbelief that protects you when you've been disappointed enough times. The internal negotiation between wanting to trust something and knowing what it costs when it falls apart. "It's real?" Annie said, not challenging, genuinely asking. "It's real," Evelyn said. "The deed is in the orphanage's name, permanent." Annie looked at her for another moment. Then she put her face in her hands. She didn't make a sound, but her shoulders shook, and Evelyn crossed the room and sat beside her and put an arm around her. And Annie, 13 years old, self-contained, carefully defended Annie, who didn't like to be seen crying, leaned into her and let go of something she'd been holding for a long time. Garrett was in the kitchen doorway. He'd been there the whole time, quiet and separate from the announcement, which was how he'd positioned himself, and how Evelyn had expected he would. He watched all of it with his arms loosely crossed, and that expression she'd come to know. The one that wasn't quite a smile, but existed in the same territory, somewhere in the stillness of his face. Sam was the last. He was sitting in his usual spot at the edge of the group, and he hadn't moved or spoken during any of it, and Evelyn had been watching him from the corner of her eye the whole time. When the initial chaos of the younger children had settled into a kind of sustained, joyful noise, Sam stood up from his chair and crossed the room, past the celebrating twins, past Rosie, who was now explaining to Eddie in considerable detail why she was crying even though she was happy, past all of it, and he stopped in front of Garrett. He looked at him for a moment. Then he put his hand out. Garrett shook it, firm, straight, the kind of handshake between people who understand each other. Sam said, "Thank you." 2 words. Direct. No performance in them. Garrett said, "You're welcome." Sam nodded once and went back to his spot. But he was sitting differently than before. Not the careful, separate posture of a person maintaining distance, but just sitting, easy, like a person who is in a room they belong in. Evelyn saw it. She looked at Garrett across the crowded, noisy room, and he looked back at her, and between them in that moment was the quiet, dense weight of everything that had accumulated over 2 months of firewood and coffee and midnight kitchen tables and 16 cups on a shelf. She looked away first because she wasn't ready to have that conversation in a room full of 14 children. But she was going to have it. She was ready. The next few weeks were the hardest kind of busy. Not the desperate, drowning busy of the crisis, but the grinding, logistical busy of rebuilding something that had been held together with emergency measures for too long. The orphanage needed attention. The transfer of the deed to the operating trust required a separate round of paperwork. There were existing debts to address, a heating system that needed a professional opinion before it was asked to survive another winter, a conversation with the county about the subsidy structure now that the facility's ownership had changed. Evelyn handled all of it. She was good at it. She'd always been good at it. The difference was that the ground beneath her felt different now. Solid in a way it hadn't been for months, possibly for years. December came in cold and clear, the kind of weather that made everything look sharp-edged and definite. The sky a hard blue above the bare oak trees along the road. The first week of December, Garrett came by with lumber and a set of drawings he'd made, basic, practical, hand-sketched on graph paper, showing how the large storage room off the main hallway could be converted into 2 proper bedrooms, which would relieve the crowding in the upstairs rooms that had been a problem since Lou had come 2 years ago, and they'd run out of adequate space. He spread the drawings on the kitchen table and showed them to Evelyn. She looked at them for a moment. "When did you do these?" "A few nights ago," he said. "After you sold 2/3 of your ranch," she said. "I had evenings free," he said. She looked at the drawings again. They were thoughtful, not just the dimensions but the details. Things like where a window should go to give each room morning light, and the placement of the closet space in a way that actually made sense for how the rooms would be used. The drawing for the second room had a small notation in the corner, south-facing, quieter side, which was exactly right for whoever was going to be put in there, and the fact that he'd thought about that made something in her throat tighten. "This is good work," she said. "I can have the framing done in a week," he said. "If the heating inspection goes fine." She nodded. She rolled the drawings carefully and set them aside. "Garrett," she said. He was still looking at the table. He looked up. "I want to talk about something," she said. He waited. She'd been practicing this, which was unlike her. She wasn't normally someone who rehearsed conversations, but this one mattered enough that she'd found herself going over it in her head at odd moments, working out the order of things, trying to get it right. She was aware, standing at her own kitchen table in the early December morning, that she was nervous in a way she hadn't been in years. "You've given this house a lot," she said. "I know that. Not just the money. I mean, that was enormous. And I don't know how to say what it means. But I mean everything else too. The months of showing up, learning every one of them, knowing which kid needs what and when." She paused. "You became part of this place without asking permission, and the place let you in, and the children let you in, and I—" She stopped. He was watching her carefully. "I've been alone in this for a long time," she said. "That was partly circumstance and partly choice. It was easier in some ways to be the only one responsible because then the only person I had to trust was myself." She looked at him. "And then you showed up with a cord of firewood, and you just didn't go away. And somewhere in the middle of it, I stopped wanting you to." The kitchen was very quiet. "I've been scared of saying that," she said, "because it's a lot. What I'm offering isn't simple. It's 14 kids in a building and all the weight that comes with it. I understand if that's more than—" "Evelyn," he said. "I'm not done," she said. "Okay." She took a breath. "I'm saying that I want you here. Not as someone who helps out. Not as a neighbor who's been generous. I want you here I want you to stay, permanently, if you want that. And I know that's not a small ask." "It's not," he agreed. "So I'm asking anyway," she said. "Because you told me once that you were thinking about something that was yours to think about. And I didn't push. And I'm done not pushing." He was quiet for a long moment. "I sold most of my land," he said. "I know. I've got the house and about 40 acres left," he said. "I can build something with that. It'll take time, but I can build something." He paused. "I've been thinking about what I want that to look like." "And?" He looked at her steadily. "I want it to look like this," he said. "This house. These kids. You." He said it plainly, without elaboration, the way he said everything that mattered. I've known that for a while. I just needed you to ask. She looked at him. You needed me to ask? You needed to want it on your own terms, he said. Not because you felt like you owed me something for the property. Not because the situation pushed you there. On your own terms. She understood that. She understood it completely, and the fact that he'd thought about it that carefully, had given her the space to arrive at it on her own, had waited, had trusted the process of it, landed in her chest alongside everything else he'd given in the last 2 months. You're more perceptive than you let on, she said. I'm quiet, he said. People mistake it for not paying attention. She almost laughed. It came out as something between a laugh and an exhale, and then she was crossing the kitchen and his arms came around her and she pressed her face against the solid reality of his shoulder and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, feeling the extraordinary ordinariness of being held by someone she trusted. Stay, she said, into his jacket. I already said yes, he said. I know. I just wanted to say it again. Outside the kitchen window, the December sky was the hard, clear blue of late morning, and the bare oaks along the road made clean, dark lines against it. And somewhere upstairs the house was waking up. Footsteps, a door, Tommy's voice starting its morning narration of events, Dottie calling for someone to help her find something she'd lost. Garrett's chin rested on top of her head. They stood there for about 30 seconds, which was as long as the house allowed before Tommy appeared in the kitchen doorway, assessed the situation with the instinctive social radar of a 9-year-old, and said, without apparent embarrassment, Are you guys hugging? Yes, Evelyn said, without moving. Tommy considered this. Okay, he said, and went to the refrigerator. She felt Garrett's chest move, the suppressed laugh. The one she'd learned was in there somewhere beneath the stillness. She stepped back. She made breakfast. The rest of December had a different quality than any December Evelyn could remember since she'd come to Clover Falls. Not easier, exactly. The money was still tight. The heating system needed a part that took 2 weeks to arrive. Sam had a difficult stretch in the middle of the month that required 3 conversations she wouldn't have described as easy, but different. Weighted differently. As if the house itself had exhaled, Garrett started on the storage room conversion the second week of December, and the sound of construction, the clean impact of a hammer, the whine of a saw, the companionable back and forth between Garrett and Eddie, who had appointed himself permanent assistant on the project, became part of the house's daily texture. The younger children treated the construction zone as a point of tremendous interest, requiring Evelyn to establish and enforce a clear perimeter at least 3 times a day. Sam, quietly and without being asked, started doing things. It was subtle at first. He fixed the broken latch on the barn door one afternoon, which had been on Evelyn's list for a month. He reorganized the firewood stack Garrett had brought in October into something more efficient, which was a thing Garrett noticed and said nothing about, which Evelyn noticed Garrett noticing and said nothing about either. He started showing up beside Garrett at the construction site in the evenings, not as Eddie's enthusiastic apprentice, but as a second set of capable hands, handing tools and holding boards with the quiet competence of a young man who learned things by watching and then simply did them. One evening, Evelyn came through the hallway and heard Garrett's voice from the construction room, and Sam's voice responding, and she stopped outside the partially framed doorway without meaning to eavesdrop. Stud's gonna need to be 2 inches left, Sam was saying. I see it, Garrett said. I would have done the whole row before I noticed, Sam said. You noticed it, Garrett said. That's the point. A pause. The sound of marking on wood. Are you staying? Sam asked. Like, after everything. Here. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Planning on it. Good, Sam said. Just that. Then the sound of the drill starting, and the conversation was over. Evelyn stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the wall. She thought about Sam at 8 years old, arriving with almost nothing and with those eyes. She thought about the years it had taken to earn the particular trust of a child who had very rational reasons not to trust anyone. She thought about a boot and a lace and a chipped blue cup, and the accumulated weight of small, reliable presences that had, over months, convinced him that the floor wasn't going to drop again. She thought about how long that kind of damage takes to repair, and how much patience it requires, and how most people don't have it, and how Garrett, seemingly without effort, simply did. She went back to the kitchen. She did not cry. She made supper. Christmas that year was the first in 5 that Evelyn hadn't felt the low-grade dread of the season bearing down on her. The financial pressure, The obligation to make it special when special required resources she was always just slightly short of. This year the orphanage had donations it hadn't had the year before, a product of what had happened becoming known and generating a brief wave of community response from people who had apparently needed to be reminded that they had opinions about whether 14 children had a home. She was under no illusions that this would last. Charitable attention was seasonal in more ways than one, and by spring the reminder would have faded. But it helped, here, now, in December, and she took it with the practical gratitude of someone who has learned not to be proud about accepting resources when they're offered. The town itself had shifted in small and uneven ways. Miriam Delaney had not transformed into a warm presence, and probably never would, but she had stopped being an active source of the specific gossip she'd been running for months, which Evelyn suspected had more to do with the changing social wind than any actual change of heart. Several people who had turned away during the crisis period had started finding reasons to be adjacent to the orphanage again, offering small donations, asking after the children by name. The particular social maneuvering of people working their way back from a position they weren't proud of having taken. Evelyn let them come back. Not effusively, not with gestures of forgiveness that would have felt dishonest. But she let them come back because she was practical, and because the children needed a community more than she needed to make a point. Councilwoman Reyes showed up in the second week of December with a car full of donated winter coats that she'd collected from a neighborhood in the city where she had family. She helped Evelyn sort them in the hallway, checking sizes against her mental inventory of 14 children, and she said at one point without looking up from the pile, "I should have fought harder at the council." "Yes," Evelyn said. "But you voted no." "It wasn't enough." "No," Evelyn agreed, "but it was something." Reyes handed her a small red coat that was exactly the right size for Dottie. "Things are going to be different," Reyes said. "In terms of county support, I'm going to make that happen." "I'll hold you to it," Evelyn said. Reyes met her eyes. "Good," she said. The conversation ended there. Neither of them was a person who needed more words than were necessary, and they moved through the rest of the coat sorting in a silence that had been cleared of the things that needed to be said. New Year came and went with the particular lack of ceremony that large households have for holidays that happen after bedtime. The younger children asleep long before midnight. The older ones allowed to stay up and watch the clock and make noise at the right moment. Evelyn on the porch in her coat with a cup of tea that had gone cold, watching the sky. Garrett was beside her. He'd brought her a new cup of tea about 20 minutes in, replacing the cold one wordlessly, which was the kind of thing he did that she had stopped finding remarkable and started finding simply correct, the evidence of a person paying attention. "New Year," she said. "Seems like it," he said. "Last year at this time I had 2 months," she said, "before it all fell apart." "It didn't fall apart," he said. "I know, but I didn't know that then." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "I was standing in this exact spot last New Year's and I was already worried. I'd already started looking at the numbers and feeling the drift. I just didn't have the letter yet." He was quiet. "I keep thinking about the version of this year where you didn't show up," she said, "where there was no cord of firewood and no Garrett Hale and no one at the kitchen table at midnight." She looked at him. "It's not a good version." "You would have found something," he said. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe not." She paused. "But I didn't have to, and I'm glad I didn't have to." He looked out at the dark field beyond the fence. There was a light on in the barn. Eddie had taken on the evening animal checks as his own responsibility, a quiet shift that Evelyn had watched happen over the last several weeks with a gratitude she hadn't entirely expressed. "I've been thinking about the 40 acres, Garrett said. "What about them?" "I want to build something on them," he said. "Not a full cattle operation, something smaller. The kids could be involved, not as work, as education. Eddie's good with mechanical things, and that transfers well. Sam knows more about physical systems than he realizes." He paused. "Tommy would probably just injure himself initially, but he'd figure it out." She laughed. "Probably." "It would take a couple of years to build," he said. "It's not fast." "I know something about things that take a couple of years," she said. He looked at her. "It's a good idea," she said. They stood in the cold for a little while longer. Across the yard, a light came on in the upstairs hallway. Someone heading to the bathroom, or Wren with her midnight wandering, and then went off again. "Evelyn," Garrett said. "I'd like to do this properly," he said. "Us. This." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was working out the words. I don't do things halfway. I don't have the patience for halfway. So I'm telling you, this isn't halfway, for me. She looked at him. I know it isn't, she said. I want to marry you, he said. Not right now, not tomorrow, when you're ready, but I want you to know that's where I'm pointed. The cold air sat between them for a moment. She had known it was coming. She had felt it building for weeks in the way you feel a weather change before it arrives. Something in the pressure of things, the direction of them. She'd thought about how she would respond when it came, in the abstract, and her responses had varied depending on the day and the hour, and how tired she was, and how much she'd let herself want things. She thought about who she'd been 11 years ago in the city, setting her clipboard on a supervisor's desk, and making a choice that looked irrational from the outside and was the most rational thing she'd ever done. She thought about Margaret Holt and 15 cups and a building that had been falling apart when she'd found it, and what it felt like to love something into health over years. She thought about what it cost to choose something that other people couldn't understand, and about how the cost had never once made her wish she'd chosen differently. She looked at the man beside her, at the solid, uncomplicated fact of him, not perfect, not simple, carrying his own history and his own losses. A man who had walked the full length of his life's work one cold morning and then let most of it go with the specific, unhurried decisiveness of someone who had thought it through and was at peace with the conclusion. She reached over and took his hand. Ask me again in the spring, she said, when it's warmer. He looked at her with that expression. That's not a no, he said. No, she said. It's not. His hand was warm around hers. Cold night, warm hand. She looked at the house, at the windows where the light fell warm and yellow against the dark, at the shapes moving behind glass, at the familiar geography of a building she'd spent 11 years filling with life and refusing to abandon. 2 new rooms being framed inside it, 16 cups on the shelf in the kitchen, 14 children asleep or nearly so in the particular sound sleep of people who were safe. She thought about what safety actually was. Not the absence of danger. Danger never fully went away. There was always a letter in a mailbox somewhere, always a 60-day clock, always the world with its indifference and its porter-shaped appetites moving against the things you'd built. Safety wasn't the absence of that. Safety was the knowledge that when it came, you were not facing it from an empty room. She had not come to Clover Falls looking for this. She had come looking for... what? Something she could do that mattered, something she could put her hands on. She had found that and had spent 11 years building it, and had almost lost it and had not lost it, and somewhere in the middle of the almost losing she had found something she hadn't known she was missing. She was not going to be sentimental about that in any way that embarrassed her, but she was going to hold his hand in the cold night and look at the lit windows of her house and feel, plainly and without apology, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Spring came slowly and inevitably, the way spring always comes after a hard winter, not in a single arriving moment, but in degrees, in the particular gradations of temperature and light that accumulate until one morning you step outside and the air has a different quality, something in it that wasn't there the day before. The construction was finished in late February. 2 new bedrooms, properly done, with windows that caught morning light. On the day the last thing was finished and the rooms were clean and waiting, Eddie stood in the doorway of what was to be his own room. He'd been sharing, and now he wouldn't be, and looked around at it with an expression Evelyn was never going to forget for as long as she lived. I didn't say anything. He just walked in and sat down on the bare mattress and looked at the window and the light coming through it. After a minute, he said, to no one in particular, "This is mine." "Yes," Evelyn said from the doorway. "It's yours." Sam's situation resolved itself that spring in ways Evelyn had not fully anticipated. He turned 18 in March, which meant that under the county's technical regulations he had aged out of the program, a formality that had been coming, and that Evelyn had been quietly arranging around for months, working with an attorney to establish the conditions under which he could remain at the orphanage in a different legal capacity as an adult resident with work responsibilities and a structured arrangement. She'd been worried about how to tell him, worried that the technicality of aging out, even with the arrangement in place, would land like another version of the word separated that had frightened them all in October. She told him the week before his birthday. He listened to the whole thing, the attorney's arrangement, what it meant practically, the work structure, all of it. And when she was done, he said, "So I'm staying." You're staying, she said, differently than before. But staying, he nodded. Okay, he said. That's all? She said. Okay. He looked at her with those dark, careful eyes, and in them she could see, if she looked carefully, the long accumulated distance between 8-year-old Sam arriving with almost nothing and 18-year-old Sam sitting across from her at the kitchen table. What do you want me to say? He said. I don't know, she said. I worried about this conversation for 3 weeks. You worry too much, he said. She looked at him. You sound like Garrett, she said. Something happened in his face, small, controlled, but real. Not quite a smile, related to one. Yeah, well, he said, and went to make himself breakfast. She sat at the table and watched him move around the kitchen with the easy familiarity of someone who had never needed to be shown where anything was because he had been here long enough that knowing was automatic. He got the coffee going. He found the bread. He moved around the space like the space was his, because it was, and always had been, and now legally was. And the world was occasionally capable of getting the technical arrangements to match the actual reality of things. April came. The vegetable garden, which had looked terrible all winter, showed the first green in the second week. Rosie discovered what appeared to be a previously uncatalogued type of mica in the creek bed behind the property, and spent an entire weekend in a state of concentrated scientific excitement. Tommy broke his arm falling out of the oak tree he'd been told approximately 6 times not to climb, and the resulting trip to the urgent care clinic in town was expensive and exhausting, and produced a cast that Tommy decorated with drawings within 24 hours, pronouncing it the best thing that had ever happened to him, which was very Tommy. Dottie and Clara both got into the same elementary school program for the following year, a matching that Evelyn had engineered with careful attention and considerable relief. Eddie helped Garrett break ground on the first structure of what was going to be, in a year or two, a small working facility on the 40 acres. Nothing dramatic, just a start, a foundation laid. One evening in the middle of April, warm enough finally to sit outside without coats, Evelyn and Garrett were on the back porch after the younger children were in bed. The night was the particular soft dark of a spring evening, still cool enough to feel the season's youth, but with that unmistakable quality of warmth underneath, the ground releasing the winter cold it had held for months. From inside came the muffled sounds of the house still awake, Annie and May in the living room with the television low, Sam reading in the kitchen, the ordinary evening sounds of people who lived somewhere. It's April, Evelyn said. Garrett looked at her. You said ask me in the spring, he said. I said when it was warmer, she said. I think this counts. He turned toward her on the porch step. She looked at him. At the face she'd been looking at for months. Not perfect, marked by years and weather, and the specific history of a man who'd made choices and lived with them, the lines around his eyes that deepened when that almost smile happened. Not a face that belonged on anything she'd ever imagined for herself. Exactly the face that belonged here. Evelyn Mercer, he said. Will you marry me? He said it straight. No performance in it. Just the question, direct and clear and entirely his. Yes, she said. Not before she was ready. Not out of gratitude or desperation or the accumulated pressure of events. Just yes, on a warm April evening on the back porch of the house that was hers. Because she meant it, and because he'd waited, and because some things, the real ones, the ones worth building, don't happen fast or smooth or in the shape you expected. They happen in firewood and blue cups and midnight account ledgers and the slow, unglamorous accumulation of a person who keeps showing up until the house can't imagine the room without them. Inside, someone turned up the television slightly. A laugh from the living room, Sam's footstep crossing to the sink. The house was alive around them, permanent, unremarkable. Home. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, on a warm April night, with the spring settling in for real, and the garden just barely greening and 14 children inside, who would wake up tomorrow in the same place they'd woken up today and every day before it. Everything.